Welcome, welcome. We are here for another trip to Sequoia National Park with Ranger Isaac. Hey, Ranger Isaac.
Hi, everybody.
It is so good to have you with us here as we're jumping into yet another session. This time we're going to go to life in the zone. What does that technically mean, sir? Give us a little bit more clue.
So, Sequoia National Park has one of the biggest difference in elevations from our lowest point to our highest point. And because of that, we have a lot of different zones inside of the park where different plants and animals live. So we're going to explore some of those zones and how those animals and plants have adapted to those zones that they live in.
Fantastic. So, as part of this session, students, if you would post your questions in the chat, I'll be reading and moderating those. And if they're appropriate and go along with our topic or focus, then I will publish them and share those with Ranger Isaac. But for no other waiting, let's hand it over to you, sir.
Awesome. So, I have a cool presentation to show you guys about the different zones inside of Sequoia National Park. But to start off, since you guys know who I am, I want to know who you guys are out there. So if you guys could have somebody tell me the name of the school you're at and how many classmates you have with you today and what state you're from, because I've heard that some of you guys are from really different places. But while you're doing that, we're going to start talking about life's in the zone. Now, like I said, Sequoia National Park has the biggest difference in elevation from our lowest point to our tallest point. And because of that, we have a lot of different habitats inside of the park. Now, a habitat is going to be determined by a couple different things. And to give you an idea of where Sequoia National Park is, for those of you that don't know, this is a map of the good old US of A with all of our national parks on it. And I am located right over here in Central California. And we are going to take a virtual tour through Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Park. So, this beautiful drawing here was made by a park ranger, and it's going to help us talk about some of the different zones that we have in the park. So from our entrance station here, we sit at about 1,000 feet. But if we went all the way to the highest peak inside of the park, we would reach 14,505 feet. Now, our first zone sits at that 1,000 starting point and goes up to about 5,000 feet. And if I was standing in front of you, the lowest part on my body would be my feet, right? So we call this first zone the foothills. Now, this is a picture of what the foothills looks like. And I want you guys to tell me, what season do you think this picture is right now? Do you think it's winter, summer, spring, maybe fall? Which of the four do you think it is?
Ooh, put your answers in the chat, friends. What season? And it's this one may be tricky because we have different kinds of colors going on in this one.
We do, yeah. We have a lot of wildflowers inside of the park that have really beautiful colors. They can range from whites like you see to those bright oranges, even to pink too. It's really pretty.
So in the chat, some of us are wondering, could it be fall? We do see some orange.
Ooh, it's not fall. Those oranges are going to be some of those wildflowers. So it's not the
Ah,
leaves.
we're going with spring.
Ooh, spring. That's a good guess. But this is actually winter inside of the foothills. The foothills are pretty unique because of the climate that we have here. Now, this next picture is what it looks like during spring and summer. A lot of the plants that you guys see end up drying out during this time. And that's because the foothills climate is unique. Now, during the winter, it's going to look like that picture we just saw. And the average temperature is going to be at a nice low of 30. So maybe a little bit below freezing, but not too bad. And we get about 25 inches of rain during that time. Now you can see that soil sample down there it's kind of rocky, pretty dry. If you picked it up and held it in your hands, you'd find it's pretty rough. And the reason for that is because during the winter, this is a pretty nice place to live. But during the summer, everything dries out. We receive a high of around 120 degrees. So it can be over 100 degrees for multiple weeks, and we receive no rain at all. Our climate is something called a Mediterranean climate, which means for 6 months out of the year, we get all of the precipitation that we will receive for the year. And then for the last 6 months, we get absolutely no rainfall. And because of that, all of the plants like to bloom and come back during the winter because that's when we're getting our rain and that's when the temperatures aren't super high. Now, to talk about how you adapt to a climate like this, we're going to talk about one plant and one animal that can be found here in the foothills. And our first plant that we'll be talking about is called the blue oak. It's going to be those trees you see in the background there. And the blue oak has a lot of cool adaptations to the foothills. One of the things you guys will notice is those roots go down really far. In fact, the blue oak has roots that are twice as long as the actual trunk of the tree is. So most of a blue oak will be its roots reaching really deep into the ground. And they reach super deep into the ground because for those 6 months where we get no rain, the only place that they can have access to water is all of the water that is seeped really far into the ground. Now, something else that's interesting about these trees is that you will see they like to spread their limbs as far out as they can. And that's also because we don't receive a lot of water during summer. So they only have a limited time to get as much water as they can during the winter. So they like to spread their limbs out as far as they can. And on those limbs, they have some pretty unique leaves. Normally, most trees will have a deeper green color, but our leaves on the blue oak have a nice light green color to them so that they reflect the heat during the summer better. And something pretty cool about them when they are small is that they look like this guy here. This is a blue oak sapling. And as you can see, when they're small, to protect themselves from predators that might eat them, they have these spines along their leaves. And these make it so that if an animal wanted to come by and eat it, they get poked in the mouth. So animals will leave these guys alone. Now, this guy is about a year old. So he's still got a lot more time to grow before he gets to be a full-grown blue oak tree. Now, something also cool about those leaves is not only do they have those spines, but they're actually pretty waxy too. And the reason why they're waxy is the same as why they're a lighter color. It's because it helps reflect some of the sunlight that they receive during the summer. Now, our animal for the foothills is also pretty cool and has some pretty cool adaptations. We're going to talk about the acorn woodpecker. Now, these acorn woodpeckers are pretty unique because they are the only woodpeckers that will store food inside of dead trees. What you're seeing there is something that we call a granary tree. And acorn woodpeckers will poke little holes inside of those dead trees. And then during the winter, they'll go around and find all the acorns they can and stuff them into the holes of the tree. And they do that so when it's summertime and there's no more acorns anymore, they have a supply of food hidden away for themselves. Now, most animals will try to hide food away and store it during the winter, but the acorn woodpecker has to do the opposite. They have to store food for summer. And something pretty cool about them is that these trees will go will be passed down through multiple generations of acorn woodpeckers. Acorn woodpeckers join together in about groups of 12, and they'll protect these trees and pass them down to future generations so that they can also store their acorns in one of these trees. Now, something that's pretty funny about these birds too is that they don't just store acorns in trees anymore. Ever since we moved into the area, they'll try to put acorns into any place that they can stuff themselves into. So sometimes when I go out to my car, I'll find acorns stuffed into the little cracks between the doors. Sometimes if I walk by a house, I'll see little holes poked into the side of it, and those are stuffed with acorns too. Now, those are our plants and animals for the foothills area. But if we go a little bit higher, we are going to hit the montane. Now, the montane zone sits about at 5,000 feet, all the way up to 10,000. And I'm going to ask you guys, what's some stuff that you see inside this picture of the montane zone?
Great question. So, teachers and students in the chat, just type, what do you notice in the montane? What do you
And you
notice in
guys
the
see
colored section? Yes.
any unique plants or animals in there?
We're looking around, and I think you have to have a pretty keen set of eyes to notice little details as we go along. It looks like one student's noticing a little black animal in that right corner.
That's right. That is going to be our animal for the montane zone, the American black bear.
And we also notice really tall trees.
And that's right. That is our plant for this zone too. So if you guys visited the park, you'd start out in that foothill zone. But as you can see on that picture, you'd have to take a really long, windy road to get up to the montane. And that road is called the General's Highway. And it has to climb a lot of elevation to get up to where we have our trees we're going to talk about. We have the giant sequoia trees up in our montane zone. And during the summer, it looks like this. We have a lot of wildflowers blooming in between these trees. And these trees take up a lot of space, so the forest isn't super dense. It's nice and open and lets in a lot of sunlight. Now, during the winter, it's gonna look like this. And this is how the park looks currently, because last weekend we had a winter storm through the Sierra Nevada mountains, and we got about 3 feet of fresh snow up in the montane zone. Now, we're gonna talk about what the climate is like, because unlike the foothills, the montane is a little bit of a nicer place to live. During the summer, it's going to look like our picture there. And we are going to sit at about 70 degrees as our high. Normally, it'll be around 60 degrees during the summer, and we'll get about 5 inches of rain. Now, because of that, our soil is a lot different looking compared to the foothills. That soil is a little bit more wet. It's kind of fine and soft. If you picked it up, it would probably feel like the ideal soil to start planting in. And that's because as we get higher up in elevation, it starts to get colder and colder. So going from that high of 5,000 feet all the way to 10,000 during the summer, it's not going to be around 100 degrees like in the foothills. It's going to hit around that 70-degree mark, which is really nice and comfortable for a lot of different plants and animals. But because we're higher up and it gets colder, that means that unlike the foothills, during the winter here in the montane, we do get a lot of snow. In fact, we get about 40 inches of precipitation, which snow, it comes down in different forms. If you guys have ever packed up a snowball, sometimes the snow doesn't stick and it's really powdery, and you can't really make that snowball. But sometimes it might be a little wet and you can pack in a really tight one, or it might be completely slushy and it just kind of falls apart in your hands. So different snow is going to amount to different amounts of water that the forest receives. And inside of the montane, those 40 inches equal roughly 40 feet of snow that we receive during the winter. Now, we don't receive it all at once. We usually will get a few feet of snow, and then it'll melt, and then we'll get some more snow. And this cycle will repeat till we get about 40 inches of fresh water up in this montane zone. And the plant that has adapted to this area is called the giant sequoia tree. Now, if you were here earlier, you heard me talk about giant sequoia trees and how cool they are. So giant sequoia trees like to spread their roots out really far because not only does it help them access water, unlike the blue oak, who has to reach really deep to access groundwater, water is more plentiful here and easy to find. So the giant sequoia tree likes to spread out its roots as far as it can. And that's because the giant sequoia tree will drink from 500 to 800 gallons of water in one day. So they need to be able to access a lot of water. And it also helps those giant sequoia trees stay standing because those trees are so strong and or so tall. When a breeze comes by, they really feel it. So they need a really wide base below them to keep them standing up straight. Now, something that's unique compared to the blue oaks as well is giant sequoia trees don't have leaves like a blue oak does. They have needles like you guys might have on some of your trees. They have pine needles. And the reason why some trees will have leaves and some have needles is because if you were to get a bunch of snow and you had leaves like these, all of that snow would pile up on top of these leaves. And eventually, it might break one of the limbs from all of that extra weight. But if you had pine needles, if you had needles like this giant sequoia tree, they will gather up the snow, but eventually all of that snow will bring it down and fall off of the tree. So it's a unique adaptation to how much snow that they get is that they have leaves that are made to release some of that snow. Now, also, the reason why some trees have needles instead of leaves is because when trees photosynthesize, they release some of the water that they have stored inside of them. Now, for trees like the blue oak, it's okay to have bigger leaves to photosynthesize. But if you're like this guy here, and you have a lot of snow during the winter, but trees can't drink snow because it's not water yet, you need to make sure that you keep all the water you have for as long as you can. So kind of like how camels can store water really well. Trees that have pine needles also store water better than other trees that have leaves. Now, we get to my favorite part, which is we're going to talk about the bear that lives inside of our park. And if you guys were here earlier, you might remember we have the American black bear inside of our park. And we get to watch a really short video about the American black bear. And I want you guys to pay attention to some of the things this bear is doing.
We don't have any audio, but if you will narrate a bit, we're good.
Oh, yeah. So black bears are really good searchers. They'll spend most of their time looking for food. So they have a really good sense of smell, and they'll try to find food anywhere they can. So, like you just seen, these black bears are digging into the ground and into logs to find any food they can. But they also really love to eat berries as well. And we have a lot of berries here inside of the park. In that montane zone is the perfect place for these berries to bloom. And an adult black bear can eat about 16 pounds of berries in one day. Now, they love berries so much that you'll see this guy's getting rained on, but he doesn't care. He'd still rather be eating berries out in the field. Yeah, this is what it looks like where they live. All right, so that was our video of the American black bear that lives in our montane zone. So, if we've talked about the foothills and the montane, there's one last area inside of the park. And that area is going to be called our alpine zone. Now, you'll notice that for the foothills and the montane, we have a road that brings you all the way up to them. But up in this alpine zone, we don't have any roads. The alpine is about 10,000 to 14,000 feet, and we don't have any roads up there. But like you see, you can go backpacking into that zone. That zone is going to be where you see all of those snowy mountaintops in this picture. And if you were to be up there during the summer, it would look kind of like this. Now, unlike our other two areas that have a lot of plant life, you can only see two little shrubs here. And that's because living in the alpine is really tough. There's not a lot of access to water or very good weather when you're so high up. So, this is what it looks like during the summer. But during the winter, it looks like this. And while at first having all of that snow seems like it would be great, if you had a couple dozen feet of snow pressing against you, it would be very heavy. So a lot of plants can't stand up to that. But the plant we're going to talk about later is uniquely adapted to that. Now, like I said, this is what it looks like during the summer. And during the summer, because it's higher up, that high went from 100 at the foothills to about 70 in the montane, and it reaches a high of 40 degrees during the summer. And during that time, they'll get about 7 inches of rain. When you go higher and higher up, clouds have a harder time holding on to all of their precipitation that they have. So as those clouds climb, they'll have no problem not raining in the foothills, but in the montane, they'll start to drop some of their water. And then at this alpine level is usually when clouds will drop all of the water that they have. And if you see in our soil sample there, it's mostly just rocks up in the alpine. There's a little bit of soil up in there where some very determined plants can grow. But during the winter, all of those plants will be covered in snow. Our temperature will drop to negative 10 degrees as our low, because when you get really high up, you also get a lot of wind, and that wind factor will drop the temperature really severely. And just like in the montane, This area also receives a lot of snow during the winter. Now, up in the alpine, they'll hold onto that snow for a lot longer. You'll see these mountaintops will still be white during the middle of summer sometimes. It's going to take a long time for all of that snow to melt away. And if you're going to live up there, you're going to have to be pretty tough, just like our white bark pine here. This is one of the trees that can grow inside of the alpine zone. And the reason for that is because this alpine tree, its roots don't go very deep down and they don't spread very far. But if you notice, his roots kind of look like they're an octopus's arms. And that's because those roots will dig into the rocks and find any dirt that they can and then hook into it. Because while they're up in that alpine zone, on top of having really high winds, during that winter, they'll have a lot of snow piled on top of them, and it'll be trying to push that tree over the entire time. So they need to anchor themselves into the soil really strongly. Now, on top of being anchored into the soil, they also have kind of a twisty bark to them. And that twisted bark really helps lean against all of the pressure that they'll have. As you guys see, these trees are kind of leaned from one side to the other, and that's going to be depending on where the snow lands on them and tries to push against them is how they're going to lean left or right. And these guys, just like the sequoia tree, have needles as well. Now, we're going to talk about the animal, and I love this animal. Oh, the video won't work, but luckily, oh, never mind. I have the video right here. These guys are called pika, and they are uniquely adapted for living up here in the alpine zone. They live in between all those rocks that we see, and they look just like that. They aren't rodents like mice or rats that you see. These guys are actually more uniquely or more related to rabbits than any other animal. And you can kind of see that with their ears being really big. Rabbits and these pika release a lot of their body heat through those big ears that they have. And while they're up in that zone, they really like to communicate to each other. So you guys are seeing these pikas standing on rocks, and they'll warn each other of coming threats and of the fact that they want to keep their own places. So these pika, kind of in opposite of the acorn woodpecker, will store food during the summer, and then over that time, it will dry out. And during the winter, when they're covered in all of that snow, they will have a granary that they can eat from. Because they're covered in so much snow, they can't really go anywhere during the winter. And if we had a pika right here, it would look just like this guy. Now, I always get asked, Ranger Isaac, can I have a pika as a pet? And I wish we could. But if you guys remember, these little guys like to live up really high in the alpine. And if it's a high of 40 degrees during the summer, that means that they're very adapted to living in that cold weather. Unfortunately, if the temperature gets above about 70 degrees, these guys start to overheat. So they really can only live up in those alpine zones. Now, those are the three zones that we have inside of the park. And inside of those zones, there's more specific, unique areas like those subalpine meadows I talked about. But do you guys have any questions about either the plants or animals we talked about or Sequoia National Park?
So teachers, this is where you can pop into the chat any questions and I will share them with Ranger Isaac. But why don't you tell us a little bit more about that pika and how they're related maybe to some other animals we're familiar with?
Ooh, yes. So this pika right here is closely related to rabbits. They are the closest relative that they have. And you can really see it when they're running around. They kind of have that jumping motion because they live in between those rocks. So that's how they are able to move around so quickly. Um, they're also similar in the fact that they like to form very small groups of them and work together. Uh, and their teeth, which I don't have on this little guy, are kind of long in the front, just like rabbits are. And you saw in that video, they like to cut down some of the plants using those front teeth and then store them again during the winter.
Very nice. And one other question that we have is, out of these areas, it's really interesting. They're noticing that one section is, a lot of snow, one has a little bit, and one has very little at all. In all of these places, do the animals ever go between the zones?
Ooh, that's a good question. Some animals do like to travel between those zones. The black bear specifically really likes to wander very far. Some of the zones that the black bears like to wander is they'll have areas for themselves that are about up to 30 miles wide. It will be how far they'll travel between areas. So sometimes we'll see them in the montane, and sometimes they'll come all the way down here into the foothills to look for food. Because black bears love food so much, they really have to travel to a lot of different areas in order to keep themselves fed.
Very nice. Well, I think that's all the questions we have for today. Thank you,
All
Ranger
right,
Isaac.
awesome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Have a good one.